comic books and largely popular culture created certain perceptions of combat and manhood and how those two are linked together. So when I was an undergraduate, I wrote several papers about junior officers, which are second, first, lieutenants, and captains during the Vietnam War. One aspect I looked at was some of the motivations they had for enlisting in the Army or the Marine Corps, their expectations of war before they arrived in combat zones. And so I was really curious about how they functioned, because when you often approach the Vietnam War, you approach it in a negative sense because we characterize the Vietnam War as a failed war of American involvement. But when you approach something negatively, you usually get negative results. And so I wanted to really focus on the ground level troops and sort of get away from a lot of these political views about the war itself. And so I wanted to see if junior officers could lead effectively, and by that I mean, could they actually muster morale in their troops? Could they get them to fight? The sort of iconic image we have of Vietnam soldiers is the draftee who refuses to take orders, who sits down on the battlefield and refuses to go on. And so, like the subjects I studied, I approached the Vietnam War with a certain set of images in my mind. And I'm sure most people are familiar with Mel Gibson's film, We Were Soldiers. And the thing about that film is it presents an interesting dichotomy of junior officers. You have Chris Klein and Mark Lucas, who play two of the junior officers within Mel Gibson's command, his brigade. And Chris Klein plays this competent, complacent, empathetic officer who cares a lot about his men, who leads them in combat and makes sure they don't take unnecessary risk. Mark Lucas, who plays Lieutenant Henry Herrick, and he's sort of someone we would remember from the film because he's this person in the very beginning that they say is all about medals. He's about winning medals and glory. And when they first arrive in battle, he sees a Viet Cong scout who runs off, and rather than killing the Viet Cong scout, he says, let's take him a prisoner, and he has his platoon chase this person on and on until they find themselves in a ambush that's been constructed, and for the next 48 hours they're stuck on this knoll, and almost the whole platoon, including Lieutenant Henry Herrick himself, are killed in battle. So what you have is you have an officer who's sort of the military's idea of a great officer, who's competent, who is strategic, who makes calculations in combat, and then you have what's portrayed as the negative type of officer, this person who, like John Wayne, is all about glory, all about demonstrating the fact that he's a hero or that he can be a hero. So I wondered if there was any shred of truth to this assessment of junior officers that we're presented with in We Were Soldiers. And so what I mean is, do these soldiers who enlist in the Army very early on have romantic visions of warfare? Do they conceptualize the battlefield as this proving ground for manhood, a place where you win glory? Is sort of abstracted from the realities of war, which is death and mortality, and just awful. And so most historians sort of divide the Vietnam War period into two periods. The first period of which is 1965, 1968. And they say that during this time period, public approval was high. Most soldiers were optimistic about the war. There was idealism among most of the soldiers. The draftee army hadn't fully composed itself during this early period. And so for the officers that I looked at, and the enlisted men I looked at too, this is generally true. Most of them are optimistic when they first get into the war. And most of the famous autobiographies of war, by Tim Burton and others, Philip Caputo, they follow this track of being idealistic and then disillusioned and then frustrated. So for this presentation, I just want to sketch out sort of the contours of the argument I had in the paper. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is the fact that John Wayne and comic books were prolific in culture in the 1950s. So they were something that you would know about, something that could make an impression on someone alive during that period. The second thing I want to talk about is how do John Wayne films and how do war comics illustrate soldiers? What is the ideal soldierly persona? And then the last thing, and this is an argument that's sort of in development, but the fact that in memoirs and letters and diaries, there is substantial evidence that John Wayne is an influence on soldiers who enlist in combat, enlist to join the Marines and the Army. And John Wayne's not isolated out here. There's other cultural icons like 007 during the 60s that influenced people to join the Spy Corps or intelligence, for example. But the way that John Wayne and war comics present the soldier is sort of imitated, or it's an expectation that soldiers try to achieve when they get into the combat zone. And by John Wayne, I'm not necessarily talking about John Wayne, the person, but more as John Wayne as a fiction that he becomes during the period. So first of all, today, comic books, it seems that comic books have ebbed some. You know, it's not as prevalent in the culture. Our most frequent reminder of comic books and what they are is usually through Hollywood superhero films, the Avengers, Batman, Superman, etc. But during the 1950s, if you were alive in the early 50s, the availability of comic books was just incredible. There was 500 to 650 individual titles, and they represented a total production of 60 million per month. And one interesting thing about comic books is there's trouble distinguishing a specific audience, but it's safe to say that children, adolescents, and adults would have come into frequent contact with comic books at some point or another. And most historians call this the proximity effect. And basically what that means is when someone purchases a comic book and they read it, those around them are more likely to also read that comic book, whether it's letting someone borrow it or passing it on to someone else. And so this is why it sort of hampers any attempt to pin down specific readership, because more people read comics than purchase them, if that makes sense. And before television becomes really a staple in the American household in the late 50s and 60s, the comic book, the newspaper, the magazine, the written word was enjoyed the highest circulation and readership in popular culture. And during the same time period, John Wayne constitutes another icon that people know about, people that know who he is. Gary Wills, a cultural historian, argues that, and who wrote a good biography of Wayne, says that Wayne's popularity reached its high point during the 50s. And even into the 1990s, Wayne was still considered one of the top 5 actors in U.S. history, which denotes this legacy that he has afterward. And this person, this journalist named P.F. Kluge, who wrote for Time in the 70s, wrote a pretty famous article about Wayne in which he blurs the distinction between Wayne as a person and Wayne as an actor when he talks about the movie cowboy or the movie soldier, rather than talking about John Wayne himself or referring to him as a person. And film historian Richard Slotkin similarly contends that Wayne was perceived as not as an actor, but as an authentic representative of the Old West or of the American soldier hero. So while Wayne and comic books enjoy different audiences during the same time period, both mediums were able to project an ideal of soldiers, of manhood, to the masses. And so what is the character of this soldier that is represented in Wayne films and in war comics? Well, comic books typically construct a vision of the soldier that suggests soldiers become heroes through death in combat. Most scenarios you see in comic books, the soldier is typically the lone survivor in battle. His squad's been wiped out, and he's faced with overwhelming odds, and he's sticking to it and gunning down as many as he can before he's killed himself. And another vision that's illustrated and more fanciful than any of the others is the idea that these soldiers, these privates and sergeants, have no direct supervision. They're sort of running amok in the battlefield. They're saving these helpless women that somehow, these helpless American women that somehow find themselves in the middle of the Korean War, and they save them, and then they're able to mow down their enemies and typically don't suffer a scratch. But the war comic industry at the time wasn't a monolith. There was different interpretations of the soldier, so I don't want to suggest that this is what all war comics conform to, because Entertainment Comics, which publishes Frontline Combat and Two-Fisted Tales, takes on a more realistic portrayal of war and soldiers. Soldiers in these comics are typically neurotic. They're scared. They are ignorant of patriotic war aims or larger war aims. And typically, the enemy is no longer this sort of paper rag doll that is able to be shot up and killed en masse, but it's a soldier, an enemy soldier that typically is formidable and at times defeats American troops in battle. But to illustrate the dynamics of this romantic war comic hero, one example will pretty much serve. And I did have a PowerPoint that would have illustrated this better, but I'll try to do it as best I can in words. But the debut issue of a comic entitled Battle Report set a somber tone for combat, and this wasn't followed by its subsequent issues. But the first episode is entitled The Terrible Decision, and it begins with the narrator telling the audience that sometimes you get lucky and have a choice. You can die like a hero or live like a coward. And the protagonist of this story, Joe, which is a typical name, he's found in the very opening frames of this comic as being alone. He's in this scenario where he's a lone survivor. He's firing his rifle into a crowd of North Korean soldiers. They're charging at him. And he's really placed in a no-win situation because he has two choices, according to the narrator. He can continue to futilely resist the North Koreans and die in combat, or he can retreat but be forever branded a coward. So I want to just direct our attention to some of John Wayne's films quickly that illustrate the same type of issue, and this is Sands of Iwo Jima, which is a 1949 film, a famous war film, and The Alamo in 1960. These two, I think, is really good films. In Sands of Iwo Jima, Wayne plays the role of Sergeant Stryker, and he demonstrates his physical manifestations of bravery, for example, by pushing Japanese tanks off a cliff with a bulldozer. That's something that most people remembered from that movie distinctly. But in the end, his heroism is defined by his death on the battlefield, and he's not killed in combat. He's killed by a sniper after after the battle was sort of ceased. And in his role in the Alamo, he plays Davy Crockett, and he exhibits similar characteristics. Crockett is duty bound. He feels personally tied to the fate of the Alamo. And he's also given this option, like Joe in our comic book, that he can evacuate the Alamo at the last minute and save himself and his men. But he's disgusted at the thought of retreating and leaving others behind. So in the end of the movie, as we can assume, finds the Alamo completely overrun, and the men are all killed. But this, this film ends with this great music and this idea that Jim Bowie and Davy Crockett and all these others were heroes. So if the hero is defined by his bravery or his death on the battlefield, well, what decision does Joe make in Battle Report? Well, he shoots himself in the foot. He finds himself alone, after he's killed a few of these soldiers. He shoots himself in the foot, and when he's found by other American soldiers, he gets a brief stint in the infirmary, and then he finds himself on a safe trip back home to the United States to his wife and family. But by some ironic twist of fate, when he arrives home, he doesn't disembark to his family waiting for him. He disembarks to this huge festival and fanfare, and he finds out that he's been awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for his bravery. And so he's torn between, trying to live up to society's idea of him as a hero by awarding him this medal, and his own self-opinion of himself as a coward, because he still feels like he should have died on the battlefield with his other men. So in the end, the comic ends with Joe hobbling back into his suburban home with his injured foot, and he's prepared to confess to his wife that he's actually a coward, he's not a hero. And the cartoonists sort of leave us with this uncertainty about what the terrible decision is, because the language that's used in the comic doesn't necessarily portray Joe as a coward. So we're left wondering, is the title Terrible Decision actually a criticism of this cultural idea that soldiers have to choose between heroic death and cowardly flight? Or does it imply that Joe's decision to gold brick and get his way back home is the decision that's terrible. So to summarize, in these films and in a lot of these war comics, we find this hero-coward dichotomy, and the ideal soldier is often a martyr for a noble cause. Heroism is equated with glorious death in combat. Cowardice is associated with usually one who has the opportunity to die, but instead flees. And the mastery of fear, a stoic demeanor in combat, and selflessness are character traits of this hero. And there's evidence to suggest that soldiers who enlist and go to the Vietnam War were cognizant of this cultural ideal. And this awareness was made no less apparent by the military utilizing Wayne's popularity to attract recruits. Although Wayne never serves in any military branch, General Douglas MacArthur calls him the model of an American soldier. The veterans of foreign wars give him the gold medal, and the Marine Corps presented Wayne with the Iron Mike Award. So biographer Gary Wills, describes this as basically the military taking advantage of what he calls John Wayne's America, where men were men and more Waynes were needed to do what was necessary for winning. So as we go back to this idea that we're presented with in We Were Soldiers, is there any shred of truth to the type of junior officer portrayed by Mark Lucas, this John Wayne type officer? And there's substantial reference to memoirs and letters and diaries of soldiers about John Wayne. And so the collective image put forth by 50s culture, this type of 50s culture, is that the American soldier is fearless, does not hesitate to charge into a dangerous situation. Richard Slotkin says that this is the double-edged quality of John Wayne, that the John Wayne syndrome, as it afflicts soldiers, is this internalization of superhuman military bravery, skill, and vulnerability to guilt and grief that leads people, leads these soldiers to do careless or reckless things. And a veteran, Mark Baker, who wrote an interesting narrative called Nam, said that he summarizes the testimony of a number of veterans when he says that the entire Vietnam War during this early time period was billed on the marquee as a John Wayne shoot-'em-up test of manhood. And the war to him was this test he wanted to pass. And so he equates war, combat, with defining himself as a man, as building men. And a number of other veterans recall, and I'll just mention a couple, but they recall, soldiers who get a real charge out of killing people, people who attempt to emulate the battlefield regalia of John Wayne by requesting these bandoliers of ammunition to strap across their chest, extra weapons to carry, or in one case, 8 grenades. And others, recall that when they're handed an M16 rifle, they feel like John Wayne with his 6-shooter. And soldiers soldiers start to use the language of Wayne to describe soldiers who are careless. So an infantryman who charges a machine gun nest and finds himself mowed down and killed is described by a fellow soldier as doing the John Wayne thing. And so there is evidence to suggest that soldiers have internalized this romantic vision of warfare, at least to a certain extent. And the narrative and memoirs of Tim O'Brien, Philip Caputa, others, they sort of follow the same trajectory. They both, talk about war in this sort of romanticized way, but soon after they realize the realities of war, they become disillusioned and they become frustrated, and that sort of characterizes this transition later on in the war, where most of the soldiers are fed up with the war. So just to summarize, I covered, the ability of John Wayne film, war comics during this period to influence the masses. I discussed how these mediums convey this certain romantic idea about soldiery. And then I also briefly suggested some findings that John Wayne had an impact on those who volunteer for military service. Thanks.